Hello and welcome back to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems, the very last module of Beyond Networks. Only 2 lectures in this module. And so what we're going to do for these last 2 lectures is we're going to speculate a little bit. And I brought back the organism picture here from an earlier module because we want to talk about the organism again. And this is the whole point of this lecture, is to sort of remind everyone that biology is about organisms. The central topic of biology is to understand organisms, how they are, different from non-living systems, how they act, what drives them, how they behave, and how that sort of active agency and behavior influences their evolution. These are wide open questions. And while the last time we looked at the sort of, perspectives, process perspectives that you can get on evolution using this sort of mechanistic dynamic explanation that I was advertising and introducing in the first part of the lecture, we're going to move on today beyond that. So this idea of dynamic mechanistic explanation, and this is very important, not only involves decomposing a system into its parts by doing genetics, molecular biology, or also causal modeling, but recomposing it again into a dynamical systems model, for example. And we were looking at examples in the last module that, looking at evolvability or homology of processes that employ this sort of approach. The recomposition is crucial because there are non-local causes in biological systems, and because otherwise you don't have a sufficient, only a necessary set of explanations, not sufficient ones. And it's useful, dynamic mechanistic explanation, to characterize these morphogenetic fields, the processes of development. And we can do that, as long as we stay below the level of the organism itself, using this biology in a box approach. We can focus in on the processes that we're interested in. We can define the boundaries of what we're looking at, and we can define our initial conditions. We can model the trajectories of the developmental processes within that window of reality that we find. And of course, as Lee Smolin reminded us, this is only a sort of a crude approximation to the true connectivity of the world. This sort of, the world is near decomposable, according to Herbert Simon. That's why we can do it, but we shouldn't forget that everything is connected. And in particular, it becomes much more difficult when we look at an entire cell or even a multicellular organism. Then we cannot use this mechanistic approach anymore. It's woefully inadequate to understand life itself. So let's go briefly, once again, over the sort of collection of reasons for this that we've gathered over the course of the entire lecture series, and draw it together to think about how could we move beyond this sort of biology in a box approach. We don't have the means yet to do this. So what we need to do before we think about concrete sort of, projects here, we need to think about what is it that we want to achieve? What kind of science is this going to be? Okay, so it's going to be very philosophical and very speculative here at this point. It's a very new sort of area of investigation. And of course, the reason why we can't use sort of dynamic mechanistic explanation for organisms is rooted in this result from Robert Rosen's work, and in his book, Life Itself. He has this conjecture where he says, no collection of separate models, however comprehensive, could be pasted together to capture the organism itself. And the reason is this peculiar structure that organisms have. They are closure to efficient causation. So every efficient cause in the organism is caused by another efficient cause within the organism. And so there are 2 sorts of ways in which you can look at that. So it has to do with feedback regulation, right? But it's not just independent processes that cause or influence each other reciprocally. Sort of a feedback relation between pre-existing processes in this sort of Churchill style view of we build our houses and then the houses shape us. But it's more a reciprocal constitution, a dialectical relation. Here's Lewontin and Levins again, you know, so the organism is both the product and the source of evolution is the name of their book chapter, if you remember that. So these are two very different beasts, and I was sort of criticizing current efforts, for example, by the extended synthesis crowd to focus on this reciprocal causation, because that stays firmly rooted in this sort of biology in a box, mechanistic approach. There's no problem with that. So at best, you know, these sort of processes, these dynamics are recursive. You basically build on something that was there before. So it's a one, you can think about one process influencing the other, and then the other this one, and so you spiral up and up and up and up. Okay, but there's no problem with this. You can model that. You know, science doesn't have a problem with this sort of recursiveness. It's a common thing in programming. You use recursively defined functions. There's no problem. They call themselves. Okay, while this reciprocal constitution involves another term, which is impredicativity, and this is a mathematical term for when the definition of something itself refers to itself. And sometimes this is not problematic. If you say, for example, okay, so the tallest of all the men in the room, okay, so that is a definition of someone which includes that someone, a group of people, you know, that includes that someone. The most famous case of an impredicative definition is the Russell set, which is sort of the barber that does the barber, you know, the barber shaves everyone in town who does not shave themselves. So who shaves the barber? That's called the barber's paradox, and that's a prime example in the philosophical literature where impredicativity comes up. So in this case, one process doesn't even exist without the other. Okay, so these two processes, they have to sort of coexist, co-generate each other. They depend on each other in a very different way. And we don't have a way to model such processes necessarily. Okay, there's a discussion about this. So look at it this way. Let's call it material impredicativity, because, okay, if you want to simulate an organism, there's an argument that was made by Matteo Mosio and colleagues already in 2009. You can actually simulate, you can make a simulation of an organism that has closure to efficient causation. So their argument goes a bit like this. Look, computers are Turing machines. So here's a drawing of a Turing machine. It has a sort of an infinite data tape and a reading head that's reading the instruction on the Turing machine, and then has a set of internal states. And depending on the internal states and the instruction on the tape, it'll move forward or backwards. And Turing had proven that this is a universal model of computation. So all the computers that humans build are Turing machines. And if you want to simulate something, it has to be running on a Turing machine type architecture. So in a Turing machine, the only source of efficient causation is the reading head, okay, the thing that actually reads the tape. And so it is possible, according to Matteo and his co-authors, to simulate closure to efficient causation on a Turing machine using lambda calculus, which is a special way of a programming environment that allows you to operate not only on variables, but also on the operators themselves. So it can basically rewrite itself. And the programming languages, Lisp and Scheme, are based on this lambda calculus formalism. So if you have a formalism where you can operate on the operators that can sort of rewrite itself, you can simulate something like a system. Well, you can simulate a system with closure to efficient causation in that simulated environment, okay, where the hardware is also just simulated. But the problem, of course, is, and this is why I call this material impredicativity, is that an organism is more like a Turing machine that builds its own reading head, okay? There's no hardware-software distinction. And even Matteo in his paper needs to admit that this is something that we don't understand, okay? So this is something that makes organisms very special and very different from non-living systems. And of course, you need the reading head for the machine to work. So there is impredicativity here, okay? So the reading head and the program that makes the reading head need to sort of co-generate each other. Otherwise, you don't get an organism. I hope this example helps, but this is a really radically different thing than reciprocal causation, which is no problem and has traditionally been incorporated in many models of coevolution and so on and so forth. So we're talking about the kind of dynamics that, you know, this sort of come out of this idea of the adjacent possible. It's sort of like a computer that not only programs itself, but builds itself, right? And this is the cell. This is the model of the efficient causes that we looked at when we looked at Yanni Hofmeier's work and his translation of Rosen's scheme into the real cell. And so Yanni points out something really important. That's the material part of the material impredicativity here. It's, you know, the closure is sort of a necessary condition of being an organism. But cells are not only autonomous, they are also material objects. They need to actually build themselves. Cells have to realize closure in the real world, materially, through self-fabrication. So you need closure to efficient causation and self-fabrication. And this is something, you know, we don't know how to build this. There is a theoretical model for this, though, from a book from John von Neumann, computing pioneer, and his co-author Burks in 1966, the theory of self-reproducing automata. They work out the conditions for a machine that's called a von Neumann machine. They call it a kinematic self-reproducing automaton. And it is based on this idea of a universal constructor. It has a blueprint, and it can, out of that blueprint, can construct itself. And then, you know, obviously that is sort of like an organism. There was a problem with von Neumann's proof that Rosen actually pointed out, but Yanni worked around this and showed that it isn't an inconsistency at all. So there, the idea you can describe using relational abstract mathematics again, this idea of a constructor. But it's not a description that's algorithmic or anything, okay? It's relational. And what's more, Yanni in those two papers here from 2017 and 2018 shows that his model of the cell is a distributed von Neumann constructor. So basically, cells are, in this view, you know, I don't like the idea of a machine because this is unlike any machine we've ever built or maybe will ever build. But this idea of a self-constructing entity, let's call it. Yeah. And so what Yanni points out in his paper is that we need an epistemology for systems biology that is essentially relational. Okay, that's already Rosen's argument in his conjecture. You need a different type of mathematics, a different type of explanation. Category theory is a purely relational field of mathematics. Okay, so it is not a mechanistic type of explanation. That views everything in the context of functional organization. So Yanni likes to say nothing makes sense in biology unless seen in the context of organization. And so this is irreducible. So this is not amenable. This type of system is not amenable to mechanistic explanation because you cannot take it apart without losing that property that, you know, belongs to, is associated with the organization of the system, meaning all the interactions in the system together. It's not localizable, okay? So if you take the system apart, you lose that organization. So how do you deal with this? So you have a bunch of problems here. If you want a theory about this, you cannot take the system apart. And so you cannot use, you know, traditional mathematical modeling approaches to model it. It's a self-fabricating system with closure to efficient causation. It's materially impredicative. Okay, so we need a completely new way to look at this. We cannot use even those sophisticated techniques of dynamic mechanistic explanation that I was introducing in the last module. It doesn't work in this context. Okay, so you have a completely different ontology as well, this stream of life conception of the organism, not a machine. But I'm with Dan Nicholson here, who writes beautifully, living forms are not in being, they are happening. They are the expression of a perpetual stream of matter and energy which passes the organism and at the same time constitutes it. Organisms are what organisms do, okay? And that's it. And so to come back, how is that? I mean, there's no magic, there's no vital force, nothing. It's completely compatible with non-equilibrium thermodynamics, as already pointed out by Hans Jonas very early on. And he writes, in engaging in the metabolic struggle against its thermodynamic predicament, that's the threat of death. You have to go on and on and on and on and on. If you're not active, you die. And if you die, you have lost this property of being alive. You cannot study it by, taking the system apart. An organism creates and individuates itself. It gains an autonomy from its environment. It can, we don't have the vocabulary for this, but it has different ways in which it can direct the energy it gains from constrained work into new work constraints. And you get Kaufman's work constraint cycles. And so it sort of lifts, that's a nice metaphor, it lifts itself up out of the huge, tremendously wide web of possible biochemical reactions. The ones that are actually happening in the organism are lifted up out of this sea of interactions, possible interactions, through enzymatic efficient closure. So amazing, okay? The ontological individual, its very existence at any moment, its duration is then essentially its own function, its own concern, its own continuous achievement. And achievement, these words you don't hear in biology, The organism's concern is to live, its achievement. These are heavily teleological terms. And the point here is that it's not bad to use this because, organization, and this is from a beautiful paper from 2015 from Matteo Mosio and Leonardo Big, which is also grounded on earlier work by Alvaro Moreno and others. They write, biological systems are natural systems and can be studied as such. They don't break any laws of physics. However, unlike most other natural systems, biological systems are teleological. After centuries of biologists trying to get rid of this, embarrassing fact, you can't. Organisms are teleological. And we've seen when we talked about teleological explanation in Dennis Walsh's framework that there is no problem with this sort of teleology. It doesn't break any sort of principles that naturalistic science should adhere to. So it doesn't involve any causation from the future or from non-existent realities, non-existent possibilities, not realities. It doesn't include any sort of you don't have to be aware to be teleological. And the sort of normativity it includes is sort of connected to the organism's goals, and its main goal, of course, is to stay alive. Organisms seem to draw their teleological dimension on a source that is different and more fundamental than natural selection. So it is not just teleonomy, this sort of apparent teleology that we get from wings having been selected for flights. That's why a wing is for flying. Okay, that's a different kind of teleology here. And it would be wrong to say the wing evolved for flying, that, the bird desired to be flying, and that's why it grew a wing. That's wrong. That is causation from the future. But the organism's goal-orientedness is a teleological phenomenon of a different kind, okay? It is okay. It is observable. It is there, and it doesn't involve any sort of magic or supernatural influences or impossibilities or things that you shouldn't assume if you do science. So you can even, thermodynamic ground it. You can ground this sort of teleology. Sorry, I'm trying to make a coherent sentence here. You can ground this teleology thermodynamically in the organizational account, the sort of closure of constraints, organizational closure more generally, that leads to self-determination, this sort of needful freedom. And this is, you know, amazing. So this is very mysterious, but it gives you a completely naturalized account of why organisms have this intrinsic teleology. So this goes all the way back to Kant and his idea that there would be no Newton of a blade of grass, right? He said that you should take the mechanistic approach in biology as far as you can, but no further, and you could never explain the intrinsic purposefulness of an organism through mechanistic approaches. And he was absolutely right. So this is what I've been trying to tell you. In the last module, I showed you where can we go with the mechanistic approaches that we have. Very important. This is what we can do right now as scientists. And what we're talking about today is this intrinsic teleology of the organism that we cannot tackle mechanistically. How do we tackle it? That's the question. So if we move from this basic fact, this observation that organisms are teleological beings, agents, natural agents, if we move from that to the evolution of organisms, we can situate it as well. So basically, we can take a mechanistic approach quite far when we study physiological, metabolic, and developmental systems, behavior of organisms, even behavior, you know, you can take behaviorism quite far, but they are all very limited, okay? So the same applies to evolution, where you can take structural perspectives. You can look at evolution from a functional replicator perspective. Process perspectives like those that we discussed last time, inspired by developmental systems theory, or even a more sophisticated sort of reproducer perspective. So this reproducer perspective already touches on the agency of animals, we said, because you need a closed life cycle, and I can't see any way by which you get a closed life cycle in reproduction and therefore replicators without some sort of organizational closure, agency, in fact, teleology of the organism, goal-orientedness. And so we should take this sort of agential perspective on evolution very serious, okay? It may be that, you know, the conditions are such that for most cases, you know, a selfish gene approach works, or, you know, a simple, you know, unit of selection approach to understand evolution. But I don't think that's the case. So we've seen from thinking about process perspectives and starting to develop them that there were a lot of things to be learned still from taking a different stance. Although we thought we knew a lot, and some exponents of evolutionary genetics even proclaimed that there's nothing really new to be discovered in evolutionary theory. I think there's this whole sort of huge area of the unknown, sort of an unknown to most of the evolutionary biologists themselves. They don't even know they don't know this. This sort of area where we examine how does the peculiar nature of the organism influence its own evolution. Wide open question. We don't know. And that's the central question in an agential perspective. Organisms are natural entities, just to drive the point home, you know. They're natural entities, to be sure, but they are no run-of-the-mill material things. Organisms constitute a special category of beings. They are natural agents. They are very different from other objects that we see in nature. They have agency. They do stuff from within. They initiate action from within. Because organisms are agents, a genuine understanding of the difference they make to the world requires a battery of theoretical concepts and explanatory modes that do not apply to the study of non-living things. And Dennis Walsh, this is his account, of course, a little cheekily calls this methodological vitalism. Very important here, there is no vital force, there is no magic, there is no supernatural force, there's no extra sort of, you know, laws of physics. There is just a different approach that we need because of the organization of living systems. Okay, so there is no magic involved. It's just, if you say you are a biologist and not a chemist or a physicist, you are already subscribing to methodological vitalism. You already agree that there is a set of methods that's different from chemistry, from those of chemistry and physics, that we should apply to study biology. And if you do that, you've already bought into methodological vitalism. You are a vitalist. in this sense. Whoa. But not one that believes in vital forces, entelechies, élan vital, whatever. No supernatural, extra physical, sort of forces necessary here. So this is not a new idea, just a brief sort of perspective historically. I want to stress this again. And it comes out of two very important and hugely neglected sort of movements in history. One is emergentism, British emergentism. And here I'm quoting philosopher C.D. Broad, who writes in 1925 in the book The Mind and Its Place in Nature, we have no right to suppose that the laws which we have discovered by studying non-living complexes can be carried over without modification in the very different case of living complexes. It may be that the only way to discover the laws according to which the behavior of the separate constituents combines to produce the behavior of the whole in a living body is to study living bodies as such. If you take it apart, you break it. You've lost it. You can't study it mechanistically. Okay, so emergentism. We have to take different levels of organization, emergence of those levels, really serious, like Grismer does in his reproducer account. The second historical movement that's very important here is the sort of philosophical biology that was done in the 20s and the 30s called organicism. And E.S. Russell here is a prototypical proponent of that sort of school. And he writes in 1945 that the directiveness of organic activities, beautiful book title. The living thing can be treated as a physico-chemical system or mechanism of great complexity, and no one would dream of denying the validity and value of biochemical and biophysical research. No, that's not what we're doing here. But such an approach leaves out of account all that is distinctive of life. This is what I'm trying to tell you, okay? So the agency of the organism is what makes biology biology. I tried to show that we cannot disregard these unique characteristics of life without losing all hope of building up a unified, coherent, and independent biology. The unified and coherent, you know what I think about that. So these were different times. Logical positivism was still very big. If you wanted to be scientific, you needed to have some sort of big theory. Today, we need a set of models, perspectives. It doesn't need to be a unified theory. We do not need another evolutionary synthesis. Thank you very much. Okay, so you can say, great. So, this philosopher, Walsh, that I didn't know before, and a bunch of other dudes from the 20s were speculating about stuff that nobody knows how to deal with. But here, look, is Erwin Schrödinger, and he writes in his What is Life, which you cannot, this is hardcore theoretical physicist going into biology, and he writes, from all we have learned about the structure of living matter, we must be prepared to find it working in a manner that cannot be reduced to the ordinary laws of physics. Whoa, that's a theoretical physicist speaking. And that not on the ground that there is any new force or whatnot directing the behavior of the single atoms within a living organism. No élan vital, but because the construction is different from anything we have yet tested in the physical laboratory. Spot on, okay. Great, thank you, Erwin. So there is no problem with, this is not unscientific, this is not flaky, nothing like that. It's just a different way of thinking about natural phenomena and trying to explain them, okay? We require different types of explanations and different types of theories. So here's the argument again. I've been over this before, I just want to repeat it quickly. So if you want an agent, sort of a theory that takes the organism as an agent serious in evolution, then you have to have a proper representation. And so the argument goes that the theories in the Newtonian paradigm are all object theories. You have a configuration space, you have objects in that space, and they behave in ways that are determined from outside their own limits. And in agency theories, that goes beyond mechanism, because action in the objects and the agents of those theories comes from within. So object theories explain the dynamics of a set of objects. And agent theories explain the commingled co-constitution of agents and their environments. So the co-generating dialectics, okay? Object theories have forces, laws, and initial conditions that govern these dynamics. they are external to the object. That's what I said before. So Walsh calls this transcendence. Okay, what happens to the object is determined from it's transcending its own limits. While agents' activities are generated endogenously. Agents cause their own changes in state in response to conditions they encounter. So this is immanence. Okay, and object theories have explanatory asymmetry, asymmetry. Principles explain dynamics of objects, but objects do not explain the principles. They're from the outside, independent. The environment poses the questions that the organism has to answer. And this is what Lewontin already criticizes, because he's very much on the agent theory side here, where you have explanatory reciprocity. Agents both make and respond to the conditions of their existence. Okay. The organism is the source and the product of evolution. So we have what Dennis calls a fractionated Darwinism with simple and useful but very abstract and limited models of evolutionary change. So all these perspectives are very, very valid, okay, in their domain of application. And then you have situated Darwinism, which is realistic about the metaphysics of evolution and is trying to put those to situate those fractionated Darwinisms into their proper context, okay? So this provides the right context. Adding new perspectives, as we learned from Jim Brisemer, is giving you an idea of the limitations of each perspective. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're not coming up with a competing theory of evolution. It is a new theory of evolution, though. It's a new perspective on evolution, and that's okay. And it's radically new because it's a new kind of science. Okay. It has to be because of all the arguments that I just gave you. And we don't know what it looks like yet. So let's try. And I'm going to go over the sort of things that Dennis gives us in his book once again. So this is from Organisms, Agency and Evolution. So he thinks an agent theory of evolution will be about agential emergentism. So evolution is an ecological phenomenon arising from the purposive engagement of organisms with their conditions of existence. So it's got a fundamentally dialectic dynamic there, okay? Sort of heavily impredicative. Because of this sort of impredicativity, you cannot separate any of the processes, inheritance, development, selection, or mutation from the others, okay? So these are jointly caused by the agency of the organism and their ecological relations with their affordances. So you're trying to sort of derive these separated processes in other perspectives. You try to derive them from a different set of assumptions, which are very sort of high level. They're very emergentist. They take the high level teleology, observable, goal-oriented behavior of the organism serious, okay? There is no privileged genetic control in this view, of course. You have to sort of derive that first. And there is no nature-nurture divide, of course, because those processes of development and inheritance and so on are not separate. And the main question is, how does the purposive behavior of the organism, the goal-oriented behavior, I should have written, impact evolutionary change? We don't know, and it's very hard to explain because all the explanations here are going to be heavily impredicative. Okay, so they're not going to be mechanistic. Okay, and so they're sort of there's just a whole bunch of chicken and egg problems here, to be honest. That's what it is. So and this question, Dennis writes, begins with the recognition of organisms as natural purposive entities, agents that enact evolution through the pursuit of their goals in the struggle for life. So it's a very metaphysically modest, as he writes, and very much in tune with Darwin's original theory, sort of starting. Okay. Now the problem is the causal structure. The extended synthesis people always talk about the causal structure of evolution. So this is the causal structure of evolution. It's a gazillion organisms struggling for life. They want to live. They want to achieve their goals. They have their agendas. Okay, so imagine you can't figure it all out. It's just going to be completely impossible to do this. So this is probably not the point Okay, it is okay to use the other perspectives. What we want to use this for is to show us where these perspectives apply and how we can situate or contextualize them. Okay, that's the important aim here, not to rewrite everything and do everything from scratch. This would be like, trying to study a human body using quantum mechanics, right? It's going to be massively complicated. And to be honest, these complications in a lot of cases are not going to be relevant at all. The point is that we want to find out in the first place, when are they relevant and when are they not? And we don't know that today. So this is one of the purposes of doing this. So let's see, how can we make any headway on this? And what would it look like? Okay, so an agent theory of evolution. Let's look at the ontology. It will be committed to the epistemology and the methodology. So the ontology would be heavily emergentist, radically emergentist. Okay, so the rules are constantly rewritten by the world, moving into the adjacent possible through this dialectic dynamics between constraints and processes within the organisms and the organism and its environment itself. So it's like one emergent co-generation nested in another. Okay, it's amazing just to think about this. Your head will hurt. And it produces at every step new rules. It's radically emergent at every step. It produces new levels of organization, like we've seen in these major transitions of evolution. Over and over again, unpredictable, fundamentally unpredictable. You cannot even pre-state, according to Kaufman, the configuration space of the system. It's completely impossible. Okay, not a predictable system. So levels of organization. The rainforest ontology is really important here. A rich world with lots of different levels, not necessarily just this Russian dole separated by different spatial scales, especially in this biopsychological thicket that WIMSAT put us in. The levels of organization are not going to be separable cleanly. They will have to be dealt with by doing different cuts, perspectives on the phenomena, because we're in this thicket where the levels are not clearly separated. But we can do local separations like we did, for example, for the semiogenesis network the last time. So it's going to be very rich. And most of all, it's going to take this organismal level and the goal-orientedness that comes with it very serious. And it's going to have to be committed to a process ontology, because this whole relational view of organizational view of the organism only makes sense, and you can only implement it materially through a process of self-fabrication. And this is all very, very much processual. Okay, if you don't understand and focus explicitly on the processes that bring forth not only the organism itself, but the environment, the perceived environment of the organism as a sort of another level, you will not understand what's going on. So this is dialectic, radically emergent dialectics within radically emergent dialectics. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be an unfolding, like a flower unfolding in the sun. But it's going to be very complicated and not predictable. So the epistemology is also going to be very different from the theories we have. It's going to have to be pluralist. It cannot be based on this sort of idea that only mechanistic explanations are valid. But as we have seen, and we have not even been over all the different explanations that are non-mechanistic in current science. So current science isn't mechanistic either. It's pluralist. It allows topological or structural explanations, mathematical explanations, statistical explanations, but this would be new here. It would allow the sort of teleological explanation that is grounded, such as the ones that include the goal-oriented behavior of the organism, but not the ones that would include, for example, a direction for evolution like omega point theory, okay? So not just the right kind of teleological explanations, the teleological explanations that are philosophically grounded in the scientific method, okay? So not some sort of flabby, I heard, I can't attribute it right now to the person who said it, but sort of a careful, not a flabby pluralism, okay? We're not very tolerant. You have to really be rigorous about the kinds of explanation that you want to allow. Otherwise, anything goes. Okay, so here's the problem. This science is neither going to be mechanistic nor predictive. It's not going to lead to control or prediction. Okay, it's going to lead to understanding, insight, and a sense of participation. The processes, these dialectics that drive evolution, also drive our own cultural evolution, our scientific progress, our lives. They're very familiar and they're very scary because they are, well, they're also beautiful. They're about the openness of our own futures, but they are about a lack of control and prediction. And this is not something we like. So we have to come to grips with that. This is the part of the world that is not a mechanism. And that's just the way it is. The universe is not a mechanism. Okay, and we cannot understand it with mechanistic explanations alone. And we never have even tried, okay, if we're honest. Although that was sort of the modernist, principle behind the scientific revolution. Mathematical formalism is a big problem, right? I was saying that lambda calculus can deal with heavily recursive and even immaterially impredicative systems. So how far can this go? Let's take it for a ride, okay? The problem with formalisms like lambda are that they're very hard to sort of analyze. Analytical approaches. They're good to simulate stuff, but they're very, very difficult to, lambda-based systems are very difficult to analyze because they are very complicated. But where do they apply, right? Can we, build some new mathematical formalisms out of the foundations of lambda calculus for, simulations of such organisms? We need to move beyond, I said that before, beyond category theory, which just gives us relational explanation, topological explanations. And we need something else to sort of replace the causal mechanistic explanations that are missing. So can we get something else to fill that void? And what are the mathematical formalisms that we need for that? This is one of my central interests here, and I need to learn a lot of new math for that over the next few years. Because, I mean, this is difficult stuff, technical stuff, but it's really fascinating. Okay, so let's think about this. Why is nobody doing this? I don't understand, okay? All right, and then the last point, of course, is about methodology. Oh my God, what would this look like? What would we do? Okay, it can be just descriptive. We can describe the purposes, the goal-oriented behavior of organisms. That's the first step, probably. But in the end, this needs to be something that is based on, we need some sort of mathematical formalism to push the boundaries beyond what we have right now. And in the end, this needs to be an empirical sort of endeavor. It cannot just be a philosophical one, okay? So it would be good if we could develop this in an empirical direction. So the dream is to have a empirical theory that takes the agency of organisms really serious and has some sort of developed mathematical formalism to do this. So we have some candidates. We have lambda calculus. We have, observations of behavior. That's easy. But there are so many open questions here that we need to start tackling. We need to have a profound and serious discussion about this, but you can't. Okay, everything is dominated by some sort of, empty talk about reciprocal causation, while these sort of things, if you talk about dialectics, you're a communist or something, right? So this is silly stuff, this needs to be discussed, it needs to be put open, and people need to learn about this. This is revolutionary. This is not just a different theory of evolution. It is a completely different way of doing science, okay? There's, but again, so we're not replacing Darwinism here. We're adding a different perspective, okay, to those theories, those perspectives on evolution that we already have. They all complement each other, they're valuable, and the more perspective we have, the more we know about the domains of applicability of each. These are not competitive or anything. So we are extending something here. We are extending the toolkit. You know, I talked about models as tools. We get a lot more tools so in the toolbox to think about evolution, okay? But there is no unified theory describing what's in the toolbox. In fact, what is a good toolbox? You know, a toolbox that only contains screwdrivers, they all fit the same mold, or a toolbox that has all kinds of different tools that you need in different situations. So this is what we need. The toolbox doesn't have to be unified, it has to be diversified. We need more diversity, more diverse perspectives on evolution if we want to truly understand it. And for that, we need a different culture in science. So in the very last lecture of this course, I'm going to philosophize a little bit about the practicalities of this. How can we actually do this? I don't think we can do it with the current academic system and the current climate of discussion, competition, anti-intellectualism. You know, if somebody thinks too much and doesn't do any work in biology, they're out. That's stupid. There's so much interesting stuff to think about. Let's think about it. What are the kind of practical conditions? What is the kind of scientific system we need to be able to do this? I think this is extremely important if we want to move ahead, and it will completely change the way we see the world and evolution as an important part in it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll tune in next time, the very last time, for Beyond Networks. Goodbye now.